Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for joining me. My name's Anna O'Sullivan and I'm excited to be here today to share some thoughts and ideas on how we can support leaders to communicate effectively during change. Or to put it another way, I'm going to look at change comms from the perspective of being a leader. So we're going to look at how leaders feel and think during change and why it's so useful for how we support them. So firstly, over the next 20 minutes, I'll cover the role of a leader during change, the job that they will be doing. Next, how communication plays into each aspect of that role. I want to then explain some of the leadership behaviours that I've observed working with leaders during my career. And finally, I'm going to share some tactics and ideas that I've used for each of these leadership styles that might be useful for you. By the end, I want to leave you with 4 key takeaways for supporting leaders through change, as well as a bunch of tactics and examples that you can hopefully use in your day-to-day work. You can also ask questions at any point during the presentation using the box below, and I'll have 5 minutes at the end where I can answer as many of those as I can. So firstly, I'm just going to transition to my slides and I will take it from there. Okay, so first, a little bit of context about Pearson, as I'll be sharing some examples from my time here. And change really is part of who we are here. So we're a company that's 175 years old this year, and we haven't always been, how shall I put this, as strategically focused on education as we are now. So if I told you that Pearson started out as a construction company, once owned Madame Tussauds, as well as the production company that made Baywatch, then I think that you get the idea. Thankfully, we've now made up our minds and we're sticking to it. We're a global learning company, an education company which combines great learning content and assessments and then powers it all with technology. We own well-known brands here in the UK, such as BTEC qualification, edXL, but we're much more than that too. We're a global business with 24,000 employees in 60 countries and an operating profit in 2018 of £546 million. Our most challenging change has been over the last few years as we've had to transform ourselves from a publishing house to a digital learning company. And I wanted to show you this slide from our recent AGM as it really marks a turning point in that transformation. You'll see us meeting expectations, achieving our cost-saving targets, digitally transforming, and starting to deliver growth as a company. But behind this progress, there's a few examples of the change we've needed to go through. The sale of a number of businesses such as The Economist, Penguin Random House and Wall Street English, shifting our business model away from selling expensive textbooks to students to instead selling access to content through subscriptions and rentals. Sadly, some job losses totaling around 3,000 people globally, investing £750 million a year in new product development, implementing single systems to replace dozens of outdated, fragmented ones, and reducing legacy applications, data centres and office locations from the thousands and hundreds down to double digits. Over the last 4 years or so, I've worked with both our finance and technology teams, including supporting the day one announcement of that £330 million cost-saving target and the associated job losses. The story behind this, or more so what I've learned, is what I want to share more on today, as well as drawing on my further experience before Pearson too. So let's get into understanding the role of a leader during change. What are they spending their time on? I'd like to divide this into 3 main areas. Firstly, identifying the vision and strategy for the change and ensuring it's the right one and the right time. 2, making decisions, often a lot of them. This is really relentless during change. This is where the pressure comes from for a leader. It's where the time and the headspace is for them, because the decision making will often be in the form of lengthy steering committee meetings and lots of bulky pre-read materials, and the leader is expected to be across all of this information in order to make the right decision. And thirdly, driving delivery, often under pressure in terms of making sure delivery is within budget and within the timescales they've communicated to shareholders, investors, customers, and employees. You'll notice that I haven't added communication as one of the jobs of a leader during change. That's intentional, because once you do that, it becomes set apart and distinct, when actually it's absolutely critical and foundational to everything that a leader does during change. So starting with the vision, that needs to be translated into a story that will inspire and motivate employees beyond their day-to-day work. It will help them to understand why budgets might need to be cut, jobs will be lost, and retraining will need to be done to adapt to new systems. And it will need to motivate them to innovate and generate ideas and commit more fully to their organisation. Decision-making, while often done within the confines of meeting rooms and boardrooms, becomes incredibly important when it generates further change. Those decisions need to be communicated carefully with credibility, strong rationale, and accountability. I'll come back to it, but one of the key roles of internal comms will be to help leaders make better decisions simply by helping them become more informed about the impact of their decisions, what needs to be done, and what's already being done. And driving delivery, well, delivery is 100% about the people. A leader again needs to motivate and inspire people to deliver, and they do this through communication and role modelling. If you've seen John Cotter's model for change, then you'll also know that driving delivery has a big heavy lift at the start in first getting the buy-in across the organisation and the support for change. And that includes building a sense of urgency, a coalition of people who will deliver the change, driving the vision itself and removing obstacles along the way. So my first takeaway is that leadership communication is critical during every phase of change. So next, as internal communicators, how do you support that? How do you unlock the potential of leadership to help them communicate most effectively? So let's move on to leadership behaviours and the actions you can take to support them. As I've mentioned at the start, I've encountered a number of different leadership behaviours which emerge during change. Often, I find we tend to categorise the leaders we support into what we observe. So those who appear to be reluctant and resistant to communicate during change, and those who really get it and lead from the front and centre. Delving deeper into the resistors in particular and understanding why they might be reluctant has helped me to adapt my support. So what influences leadership behaviours during change? I'm now going to work through 5 of the drivers that I've seen that influence leadership behaviour during change, and also some of the lessons I've learned for how comms can support in these situations. The 5 drivers I've identified are as follows: time, style, environment, distance, and by that I mean the emotional distance between leaders and employees, and finally skills. So let's start with the first driver of leadership behaviour during change, which is time. And by this I mean, what keeps the leader awake at night? Where are they spending their time? Earlier I shared the role of the leader during change, the steering committee groups, and the decision making and the risk management, which fills the bulk of the time for a leader during change. So how do you solve for that? Well, I think what's really important here is a number of things. Firstly, understand the change, and where you can, understand where the pressure points will be. As an example, on the day we announced that £330 million cost saving programme to the market and our investors, I also had to help our Chief Financial Officer communicate this internally to his finance function of 1,400 people globally. In our last catch-up, he talked me through how he had essentially had to memorise reams and reams of information and data for each financial market update. And this one was going to be particularly challenging because it wasn't good news to be sharing. So it was that insight that helped me develop a plan to support him that would be in tune with the pressure and heavy workload he was under, while also still ensuring he was going to be supporting his team through the announcement. Likewise, work out when you'll get the most attention and focus from them. I used to meet with our CFO in the early mornings if I could, because that was the best time for him. And where a leader is time poor, be the person able to represent employee sentiment back to them in a concise way. You can add huge value by taking the pulse check of the organisation and delivering it back to them when they're unable to be out and about as much as they would like to be. An added bonus is that this data and insights can also help them to make better decisions too. Remember how important visibility is during change, so support the leaders to be visible, but optimise their time. Work with an assistant, for example, to review their calendar to work in opportunities for them to spend time with employees as part of their other work. For example, a business meeting in another location, you can add on a town hall while they're there, or simply a walk around the office. Finally, with a time-poor leader, work out where you can add the most value, and then remember that your other channels are really important too. You can drive ownership through other leaders and senior managers. So on the day of our big announcement, I arranged for our CFO to run a 30-minute briefing for his skip level team. So that's the group that reports to his leadership team. They're a group of around 30 vice presidents that could help him to reinforce the communication messages, spread the load, so to speak, and answer questions among their team. Now moving on to the second driver of leadership behaviour during change, and this is style. Leadership style and differing personalities can and should always influence the channels and activities you recommend during change. Your goal is to help a leader to show their most authentic self, because this is the only way you'll build trust with employees. So I can think of one example with a leader I proposed floor walking to during the key change periods, and it was a disaster. He hated it because he's generally an introvert, and this sort of style just didn't work for him. But actually put him into a more structured environment, such as a town hall or an open forum, and he was wonderfully engaging and personable. So when taking into account different personalities, some approaches I suggest include: firstly, just ask them, how do they prefer to communicate? Where do they feel most comfortable? Simple, but how often do we actually do that? Second, always prioritise face-to-face, but look at how you can adapt that to suit the introverts versus the extroverts. So at Pearson, we run sessions called Unplugs. These are totally unscripted, unstructured, hour-long meetings between the leader and a small group of around 10 to 15 employees, where the employees have the opportunity to discuss what's on their mind and ask the leader anything they want. These are much more suited to an introverted leader, although they in fact tend to work well with all leaders. Particularly with the introverted leaders, think about how you can convey their personality and look to get those wheels in motion for this, ideally before any change begins. So I used to interview a different leader at each of the town halls that we held, and use the opportunity to ask them about their life outside work, their family, hobbies and interests. This always received positive feedback from the employees, as it helped connect with them on a much more human level. Plus, it becomes a conversation starter during one-to-one interactions. Moving on, the third driver of leadership behaviour during change is the environment. And by this, I mean that change requires leaders to communicate in uncertain and ambiguous times. It goes against a lot of what leaders see as their role as a leader, to direct and guide with strength and certainty. It can be really uncomfortable and require vulnerability that's not been required before. So your job as a communicator is to help a leader to feel more comfortable being vulnerable. I'll give you another example. My go-to advice for leaders has always been, please communicate regularly, even when you don't know the answer. I've always suggested that they just take a note of the question and commit to getting back to the group at a later date. Sounds easy enough in theory, right? This is so hard. Now that I've led my own teams of people and we've been through our own change and restructure, I was faced with this challenge personally. And what did? I postponed team meetings, and I worried about what to say because I didn't have the answers to the questions. Conversely too, there's a nervousness when the leader has much more information than they can share right now. They don't want to mess up and say more than they should. So in these situations, and having gone through it personally, as I mentioned, your main goal is to help a leader feel more comfortable being vulnerable. This is where you need to focus on three things. Firstly, have good conversations and coaching with the leader. Work through scenarios of how to handle these difficult situations and help to normalise it for them by using examples of how others are handling it. You could almost run it like a media training session where you pose the questions that employees might ask and see how the leader responds and help them with answers. Secondly, provide some documented frequently asked questions and scripts, and then where possible, start with the smaller face-to-face groups to give leaders the opportunity to build their confidence. Reinforce afterwards that they handle things well and provide feedback on where they can build on that for next time. And finally, build trust early. In this situation, your pre-existing relationship with a leader will really help. If the leaders trust you, you're much more likely to have them willing to give it a go. So on to the fourth driver, which is distance. And as I mentioned, by that I mean the empathy disconnect that often happens between leaders and employees. I know the change curve will be super familiar to most of you, and it really is still the best way to understand why leaders can sometimes unintentionally appear tone deaf to employees. They've gotten used to the change over the course of weeks, maybe months before employees get to hear about the change. There's that empathy disconnect there, and it's your job to bring that back. So how do you do that? Firstly, it's your job to manage the risk that they will appear out of touch. You can do that by relaying the insights that you've gathered from employees. However, of course, the most powerful way to do this is to show rather than tell a leader what is happening on the ground. So I arrange regular meetings between leaders and a small group of employees in the form of a coffee and conversation event or an unplugged event where they could hear firsthand and in-depth about how employees are feeling. While big town halls are great for presentations and visibility, it's the smaller groups that provide the aha moments for leaders about how employees are feeling. And the final driver of how leaders behave during change is skill. This is thankfully the easiest one to tackle, a leader who's willing and ready, but needs some help to get started. To support these types of leaders, invest some time explaining some of the best practices around change communication while you have that willingness to learn, so that you're also helping develop their own capability for the future. You could also co-create a plan with them for employee engagement, which meets their needs and suits them. Finally, provide the tools and templates for them to run with it themselves, such as activity planners, FAQs, how-to guides for running events, etc. Doing this with leaders during smaller change means it will be much easier for you to support them during the pressure of much larger change. So that's hopefully some insight into the headspace of different leaders during change. All of these can be different reasons behind a reluctance or a willingness to communicate, and often you will find that a leader may have multiple drivers behind how they act. One final point I want to make that is important for all of this is that although leaders may not always follow your advice, never lose sight of the fact that you are the comms expert and you're paid to give them your counsel. So there will be days when the stress perhaps comes flowing in your direction, or you say something that they might not want to hear, and they push back on you and it feels like it's personal. But hold your nerve, trust your instincts, and believe in your abilities as a professional communicator. They might not thank you now, but they will later. So to end, I want to leave you with some final key takeaways. Firstly, effectively supporting leadership during change starts way before change. It starts now. It starts with the relationships and the trust you have built with the leaders that enable you to cut to the heart of issues during change. Crucially, put yourself in the shoes of the leader to understand the barriers and the complexities to their role, which you'll need to take into account when proposing change communications. If there's one thing I leave you with, it is not to take at face value the resistance or reluctance that you might encounter, but to delve deeper to understand why and how you can fix it. 3, take the time for yourself. If leaders are in the eye of the storm, then that means you are too. You'll see everything up close, you'll feel the pressure they're under, you'll always feel that you can do more, that you can do better. But 4, remember it's worth it. Going through major change at Pearson has led to the formation of much deeper shared understanding between the business and the communications teams. By focusing on helping leaders to be visible, authentic, and vulnerable, we've forged greater relationships for the future and leaders who are much more effective communicators all around. Thank you.